The funeral home on Keswick Street had two viewing rooms side by side, separated by a wall so thin you could hear the organ music from one bleeding into the other like water under a door. Reed had known this technically because the receptionist at the front desk had told him when he came in out of the rain, had said second door on the left for the Hartley service, and he had said thank you, and walked down the corridor with his wet coat dripping and his mind still half occupied by the work call he had ended 3 minutes ago in the parking lot. And he had opened the first door on the left instead of the second, and he had sat down in the back row of a room full of strangers mourning a man he had never met. He realized his mistake approximately 4 minutes after sitting down, when the order of service was passed along the row, and he looked at the name on the front, and it was not Hartley. He sat for a moment with the program in his hands. At the front of the room, a minister was speaking in the low, unhurried way of a man who had done this many times and had made peace with the rhythm of it. The room was full. 100 people, maybe more, arranged in the rows with the specific posture of people present in their grief, some upright and still, some slightly forward, some with their heads bowed in a way that could have been prayer, or could have been the simple surrender of a body too tired to hold itself properly. He should leave. He knew he should leave. He could slip out the back quietly enough. The door behind him was close, but the minister was speaking, and the room was hushed, and the particular quality of leaving a room full of grieving people felt, in the moment of considering it, like a kind of violence he was not willing to commit. He would wait for a natural pause, a hymn perhaps, or a transition between speakers. He would leave at the first reasonable moment and find the correct room and pay his respects to the correct dead man, and no one would know. He stayed through the eulogies. He could not have told you afterward exactly why. There was something in the room that was not his grief and not his loss, and was nevertheless arriving in him in the way that certain music arrived, that moved through you, not because it was about you, but because it was true, and truth was indifferent to the question of whether you had earned the right to receive it. He sat in the back row of a stranger's funeral and let the mourning be what it was. The first eulogy was from a man who appeared to be a colleague, measured and articulate, the eulogy of someone who had prepared carefully and was delivering what he had prepared. The second was from an older man who had known the deceased since childhood, who got through most of it and then stopped, collected himself with a breath that the whole room seemed to breathe with him, and continued. The third was from a younger man at the end of the front row, who had been still as a closed door through the entire service, and who stood and walked to the front with the quality of someone who had decided, rather than arrived at, the decision. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked set by habit rather than by nature. He had the controlled quality of an alpha in the particular extremity of a situation he was managing rather than experiencing, the specific containment of a man who had understood that if he allowed himself to feel it fully in this room, he would not be able to speak. And he had people to speak to, and so he was choosing, with every visible muscle and breath, not to feel it fully. He spoke about his brother. His name was Jonah. His brother's name had been Marcus. He spoke about Marcus the way you spoke about someone who had occupied a specific and irreplaceable position in your interior world, the person who had been the mirror and the foil and the first reader of every important thing. He did not manage it entirely. His voice held through most of it, and twice did something that was not quite breaking and was not quite not. He looked at the room while he spoke, and his eyes moved through the rows, and at some point they found Reed in the back row and stayed for half a second before continuing on. Reed sat with the order of service in his hands and the rain on his coat, and the feeling, irrational and specific, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, that the wrong room had been, in some way he could not account for with logic, the right room. He stayed through the end of the service. He stood for the final hymn and held the program and did not sing because he did not know the words and felt it would be wrong to pretend. And when the service concluded and the room began to move, he let the rows ahead of him filter out, and he stood and turned to the door. "I don't know you." He turned back. Jonah was standing 6 feet away, having arrived there from the front of the room in the time it had taken Reed to gather his wet coat and his composure. Not an accusation, a statement delivered with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been surrounded by people who knew him all day and was noting out loud a deviation from the pattern. Reed said, I sat in the wrong room. I'm sorry, I came for the Hartley service next door and I got the rooms mixed up. I should have left earlier. Jonah looked at him. The gray eyes, which had carried all that controlled distance through the eulogy, were doing something else now, up close, something less controlled. He said, How long were you in there? The whole service, Reed said. I kept waiting for a moment to leave. That didn't feel wrong. Something moved across Jonah's face. He said, There wasn't one. No, Reed said. There wasn't. They stood in the emptying room for a moment. The last of the other mourners were filing out. The minister was speaking to an older woman at the front who had the specific posture of a person being held together by the deliberate efforts of her own spine, which Reed recognized as the posture of someone who had been strong in public all day and was spending the last of it. Jonah said, The reception is in the room across the hall. Come. It was not a question. It had the grammar of an invitation, but the weight of something else. Something Reed could not name precisely, except that it came from a man standing in his brother's funeral who had spotted a stranger in the back row and had, for reasons possibly neither of them could have explained, decided he wanted that stranger to stay. Reed said, I didn't know him, your brother. It doesn't seem right to come to the reception. You stayed through the whole service, Jonah said. You sat with him. Reed did not have an answer to this. Jonah turned and walked toward the door with the certainty of someone who had not seriously considered the possibility of no. And after a moment, because there was nothing in him that wanted to be anywhere else right now, Reed followed. The reception was in a large carpeted room with long tables and the specific catering of a gathering where food was provided not to be eaten, but to give people something to do with their hands while they managed the hard work of condolence. Reed stood near the wall with a glass of water and watched the room organize itself into the groups that formed at these events, the childhood friends clustering against one wall, the work colleagues near the table, the family at the center doing the particular labor of receiving grief from person after person without getting to set it down. Jonah was at the center of it, receiving, shaking hands, being embraced, saying the words that were required. He did it with the efficiency of a man who had decided that this was a task with a finite duration and he was going to complete it. Reed watched him work through it and recognized something in the quality of it, the specific isolation of being the person the room organized itself around, the person everyone was present for and no one was actually with. He had been at enough gatherings of consequence to understand that the center of a room was sometimes the loneliest place in it. Once Jonah looked up from a conversation and found Reed across the room, and the look lasted only a second, but had in it the quality of a man checking whether a thing was still there. Reed stayed where he was. He finished his water and found more water and stayed. He was deciding to leave. He had been deciding to leave for 20 minutes. The Hartley service had presumably concluded, and there was nothing more he could do for his colleague's family that was more than the usual inadequacy of showing up, and he had not shown up for them, because he had been sitting in the wrong room for an hour. He should go and say something to whoever remained of the Hartley gathering, and then go home. He was not leaving. Jonah appeared at his elbow. He had extracted himself from the center of the room with the specific efficiency of a man who had decided he was done being the center and had moved before anyone could stop him. He had a glass of something amber in his hand. He looked at Reed's water and said, That's insufficient for today, and went to the table and came back with a second glass of amber and handed it over. Reed took it. He noticed that Jonah had positioned himself at an angle to the room, the way people position themselves when they wanted to be present but not available, when they needed to see without being seen approaching. It was the posture of a man who had been the most visible person in the room all afternoon and was using Reed as a form of cover. Reed understood this and did not comment on it. He had been used as cover before and considered it a reasonable function. Reed said, "How are you doing?" "That's the 43rd time someone has asked me that today," Jonah said, not unkindly, just precisely. "You don't have to answer it," Reed said. Jonah looked at him. "Everyone who asks it needs me to answer a particular way," he said. "They need me to say I'm managing, because if I'm not managing, then they have to worry, and they're already worried about their own grief, and they don't have capacity for mine on top of it." He paused. "You don't know me. You don't need anything from my answer," Reed said. "So, how are you actually doing?" Jonah was quiet for a moment. He looked at the room, at the groups of people managing the afternoon in their various ways, and then he said, "He was the only person in my life who said what he actually meant, and I didn't know that was a rare thing until I lost it, and looked around and realized everyone else is speaking in a language I've always found slightly imprecise, and he was the one who translated. The amber was whiskey, good whiskey, and Reed drank some of it and let the statement be what it was. He thought about what Jonah had just described, the experience of losing your translator, the person who took the imprecision of the world and rendered it accurate, and who had done this so consistently and so naturally that you had stopped noticing it was happening, the way you stopped noticing what held the roof up until the holding stopped. He had known something like this and did not say so because the moment was not about him, but he held it and recognized it and understood why Jonah had needed to say it to someone who was not already inside his grief, someone new, someone without a history with it, someone whose only relationship to this loss was the 4 minutes since Jonah had spoken it aloud. He said, "How long ago did it happen?" 11 days, Jonah said. "Heart." He was 39. "No warnings or none we knew about." Reed said, "I'm sorry." "Yes," Jonah said. "Everyone is." And then, "What's your name?" "Reed." "Jonah." He said it without the extension, without the last name, the introduction of a man offering the only part of himself he currently had ownership of. "What's your work?" "Architecture," Reed said. "I design residential spaces mostly. I moved here 4 months ago. The man next door, the Hartley service, was a colleague I'd known from a previous city. We weren't close, but he was one of the first people who was kind to me when I arrived somewhere I didn't know anyone." Jonah said, "Why did you move?" Most people would have asked something softer. Most people would have worked up to the direct question with several preliminary exchanges. Reed had the sense, speaking with Jonah, that the preliminary exchanges were a convention he had run out of patience for somewhere around the 39th person asking how he was doing. "I needed to start something over," Reed said. "The version of the life I had in the previous city had reached the end of what it was going to be, and I couldn't see clearly from inside it. I needed the distance of somewhere new." Jonah said, "Did it work?" "It's been 4 months," Reed said. "I can see more clearly. Whether what I can see more clearly is useful is still unclear." Something shifted in Jonah's expression. A small thing, but Reed caught it. The quality of a man who had heard something that landed not because it was dramatic, but because it was exact. "Marcus used to say something like that," Jonah said. "He'd say distance was only useful if you knew what you were trying to see. Otherwise, you were just farther away." "He sounds like he was precise," Reed said. "He was," Jonah said. "It was the most annoying thing about him, and it is the thing I would give most of what I own to have in the room with me right now." Reed looked at him. He thought about his own brother, who he had not spoken to in 2 years, who was alive and well in another city, and simply absent in the way that adult siblings sometimes became absent, through accumulation of distance and the failure to counteract it, the repeated decision to let a week become 2 weeks and 2 weeks become a month until the months were a form of wall, and neither of them could quite remember who had started building it or whether either of them had intended to. He thought about what it would mean to have that absence be permanent rather than a failure of effort. He thought about all the things you did not say to people in the years when you believed the years would keep arriving, when the conversation you meant to have could be postponed because there was always more time, which was the central and reliable lie that distance told you. He said, I have a brother I don't talk to, have not talked to in 2 years, no reason except that we let the distance get comfortable. He paused. I think I'm going to call him when I leave here. Jonah looked at him for a long moment. He said, Good. A woman appeared at Jonah's elbow. She was 60, perhaps, with his jaw and a version of his eyes and the quality of a person who had been managing things all day and was checking on the management of one more thing. She looked at Reed with the polite interrogation of a woman who did not recognize him but was not going to make an issue of it at her son's reception. Jonah said, Mum, this is Reed. He sat with Marcus today. The woman looked at Reed. Something moved in her eyes. She said, Did you know him long? Reed decided, in the split second available, that partial truth was the only kind that served anyone here. Not as long as I would have liked, he said. The woman reached out and took Reed's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment with the specific grip of a woman transferring something. Then she looked at her son and back at Reed and said, Thank you for staying, before she moved on, and Reed understood that she was not thanking him for the service. She was thanking him for being beside Jonah now, at the edge of the room, at the angle that was cover, and that she had recognized what it meant and was not going to say it directly in the way of people who understood that direct saying was sometimes more than a moment could hold. An older man approached a few minutes later, Jonah's uncle or a family friend of that generation, who shook Reed's hand and said, You were in the back row. I noticed you during the service. You were paying attention. He said it as a compliment, the observation of a man who had been watching the room and had noted the quality of Reed's attention and considered it worth naming. Reed said, It was worth attending to. The man nodded and moved on, and Jonah, who had heard this exchange, looked at Reed with something shifting in his expression. Jonah watched her go. He said, She'll be fine in a year. Right now she's holding everything, and she'll hold it until she doesn't have to, and then she'll grieve properly. She and Marcus were close in the way that second sons and their mothers sometimes are. You're the older, Reed said. It was not a question. By 4 years, Jonah said, which meant I was the one who was supposed to have things handled. Marcus was the one who was allowed to be uncertain. I always thought that was a worse deal for him. I'm revising that, Reed said. You were allowed to be certain about things. That's not nothing. I was required to be certain about things, Jonah said. Those are different. They stood together by the wall, and the afternoon moved around them. People came to Jonah, and he received them. And Reed stepped back slightly when they did and stepped back to beside him when they moved on, a rhythm that established itself without being designed. He was aware, as it established itself, that he had been here for nearly 2 hours, that the Hartley gathering had long since dispersed, that he had no reason, practical or social, to stay. He stayed. At some point they found chairs, the two of them, near the window where the rain was still going against the glass, in the rhythmic way of October rain that had decided to stay. Jonah sat with the specific release of a man whose body had been held in a sustained tension for hours and had briefly been given permission to unlock a degree. He looked older and younger at once, the way people looked when exhaustion removed the performance and left the actual face, less managed, more present. Reed looked at him and thought, this is the first time today he has sat down. He had been standing since before the service, Reed thought, or had been upright in every sense that mattered. And the sitting was a small but significant thing, the body acknowledging what the mind had not yet been permitted to. He said, Tell me about the architecture. Reed said, What do you want to know? Whatever you'd tell someone who asked. Reed said, I design spaces for people to live in, which sounds simple but is the hardest thing to do well, because the way a person lives is specific to them in ways they often can't articulate. They'll say they want light, and what they mean is they want a particular quality of morning. They'll say they want space, and what they mean is They want to stop feeling crowded by their own life. My job is to translate what people want into the actual physical conditions that will produce it. Jonah said, translation, yes. So you understand the difference between what someone says they need and what they actually need. That's the whole job, Reed said. Jonah looked at him with a quality that was not quite a smile, but was the closest he had come to one all afternoon. He said, Marcus would have liked you, simply as a fact, with the particular quality of a man who did not make this kind of statement lightly and was offering it in full knowledge of its weight. Reed felt it land. The specific weight of being liked by someone you would now never meet. Tell me about him, he said. So Jonah did. Not the eulogy version, not the careful public account with its appropriate anecdotes and its managed pauses. The other version, the one that came out in the chair by the rain-streaked window, with the reception thinning around them and the afternoon going gray, the version that had no audience because the only audience was a stranger who had nothing to protect and nothing to perform for, and no need to receive Jonah's grief in any particular way. He talked about Marcus as a child who had taken everything apart to understand how it worked and had occasionally been unable to put it back together. Their mother's radio, a kitchen clock, once, memorably, a bicycle that had been disassembled into its components on the garage floor and had remained in that state for 2 weeks while Marcus studied the problem of reassembly from first principles rather than simply looking up the answer, because he said looking up the answer was admitting the thing was smarter than you. About Marcus at 22, failing spectacularly at a business venture and calling Jonah at midnight, not for consolation, but to think out loud, to use Jonah's silence as the surface he needed to work the problem. Against. Jonah had stayed on the phone for 3 hours that night, barely speaking. Marcus had said at the end of it, thanks. That's exactly what I needed. Jonah had said, I didn't say anything. Marcus had said, I know, about the apartment Marcus had lived in for 8 years, that was chaotic in specific ways that turned out, when you understood the system, to be extremely organized. Jonah had disliked the apartment for years before he understood it, and understanding it had felt like learning a language. About a trip they had taken 3 years ago to a country neither of them had been to, driving through countryside neither of them could name, arguing about directions without a map because Marcus said maps were answers and he was interested in the questions. They had been lost for 4 hours, and Marcus had been entirely at ease, and Jonah had been entirely not at ease. And at the end of it, when they finally found the town they were looking for, Marcus had said, see, we got here. And Jonah had said, we would have gotten here faster with a map. And Marcus had said, yes, but look what we saw. Reed listened to all of it. He did not prompt and did not redirect and did not offer the reflexive consolations that turned someone else's grief into a project for the consoler. He simply listened with the quality of a man who understood that some things needed to be said into a specific kind of silence, and that his job in this particular exchange was to provide that silence and hold it steady. When Jonah stopped, Reed sat with it for a moment before speaking. He said, he sounds like someone who knew exactly what he was doing, even when it looked like he didn't. Jonah said, that's exactly right. That's exactly it. He looked at Reed with the gray eyes that had been so contained in the eulogy and were not contained now, not broken either, just open in the way of a man who had found, unexpectedly, a room where the door was unlocked and had walked through it without deciding. 2. How did you know that from what I said? The midnight call, Reed said. He didn't call for consolation. He called to think. He knew what the call was for. Jonah was quiet. The rain continued. Somewhere in the building, the organ had started again from the adjacent room. A different service, a different grief, the building doing its daily work of holding loss. I don't know what to do now, Jonah said. It was the simplest and most unguarded thing he had said all day. Said not with despair, but with the honest bewilderment of a man who had always had a next thing, and was looking at the space where the next thing should be, and finding it empty. I know that grief has a process. I know that time does the thing time is supposed to do. I know that in a year I will be able to hold this differently. I know all of that. He paused. I don't know what to do tonight. Reed said, Tonight you don't have to do anything. Tonight is just tonight. That's simple, Jonas said. Simple. Things are sometimes correct, Reed said. And sometimes the most useful thing is not a plan, but just the information that tonight is a finite thing, and morning will be different, not better necessarily, just different. The texture of it changes. Jonah looked at him. Are you speaking from experience? I moved to a city where I knew no one 4 months ago, Reed said. I have had a number of nights that were just tonight, Jonah said, and the mornings. Different, Reed said, as promised. Something in Jonah's face shifted. The jaw, which had been set since Reed first saw him, released a degree. The specific unlocking of a man who had been given information that was not reassurance, not it will be fine, not time heals, not the standard issue consolations, but a true and modest thing. Tonight is tonight. Morning will be different. Reed had not asked him to feel better. He had simply described the mechanics. Jonah looked at him. The assessment quality, the eyes that decided things but aimed not at a problem now, aimed at Reed specifically. He said, I kept waiting for you to leave. I kept trying to, Reed said. Why didn't you? Reed considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He said, You gave me the good whiskey and asked me about my work. Nobody asks about the work at these things. Something happened in Jonah's face. Not a smile exactly, adjacent to one. The muscle near his jaw released very slightly, the first such release Reed had seen in 4 hours. He said, Marcus would have asked about the work. He asked everyone about their work, not as small talk. He wanted to know what people were actually doing with their days and why. Then it's fitting, Reed said, that I'm in the wrong room. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them, while the last of the family drifted toward the door and said goodnight to Jonah in the quiet voices of people who had spent everything they had for the day. Jonah stood and embraced each of them and shook hands and said what needed to be said and watched them go. Then he sat back down. Reed said, Is there somewhere you need to be? Someone coming to stay with you. My mother is at the house, Jonah said. She'll stay for the week. She's better at this than she thinks she is. He looked toward the window where his mother had been standing earlier with the older man. She spent 30 years taking care of other people's difficult moments and has decided this makes her bad at having her own. It makes her better, she just can't see it from inside it. You're describing yourself, Reed said. Jonah looked at him. Yes, he said. I suppose I am. I'm not good at being taken care of, Jonah said after a moment. Who told you that? Reed said. Jonah looked at him sharply. That you're not good at being taken care of. Someone told you that or you decided it. It's not a fixed condition. The sharp look held for a moment and then released. Jonah said, I decided it a long time ago. It seemed like the safer arrangement. Safer for you or for the people around you. Jonah was quiet. Both, I thought, Reed said. Marcus, was he the exception? He was the only person I didn't manage, Jonah said, who didn't require managing. He just knew what was true about me and proceeded from there without making it a negotiation. He looked at his hands. I didn't know what to call that while I had it. I have a precise name for it now. If you're finding this story somewhere in your evening, thank you for being here. Subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment wherever you're listening from. I read every single one. Now back to Reed and Jonah. The catering staff had finished their quiet work, and the room had the particular quality of a space that had held something and now was releasing it. The chairs were still arranged in their informal groupings, but the glasses were cleared, and the tables were clean, and the afternoon was fully gone, replaced by an early evening that pressed against the rain-gray windows. Reed stood. He put on his still damp coat. Jonah stood too, which Reed had not expected. They were the same height, he noticed, which he had not clocked before, because Jonah had seemed taller throughout, but standing level, they were matched. Jonah said, Thank you for staying. Reed said, I should have left 3 hours ago. Yes, Jonas said, I'm glad you didn't. Reed said, I'm going to call my brother from the parking lot. Jonah said, good, and then, let me know how it goes. Said the way you said things you were putting forward carefully, the way you offered something small and slightly exposed, as if the word lit and the word me had been weighed before being placed. Reed looked at him. You don't have my number. No, Jonah said, I'd need it for that. They stood in the empty room with the chairs and the last of the gray light, and Reed thought about the order of service still in his coat pocket, the wrong name on the front, the right room in the wrong building, the way a thing could be an error and also not an error, depending on what you were measuring it against. He thought about a man who translated for the people who loved him, who asked everyone about their work, who took things apart to understand how they worked. He thought about the specific and irreplaceable weight of a person who said what they actually meant. He took out his phone. He typed his number and handed it over. Jonah looked at it. He handed his own phone to Reed without being asked, which was the fullest thing anyone had done in the exchange, the offering of the instrument before it was requested. Reed typed his name and handed it back. Jonah said, There's something wrong with the ceiling in my kitchen, the plasterwork near the light fitting. I don't know if that's architecture or something else. That's something else, Reed said, but I can tell you who to call. He paused. Or I can. Come and look at it, if you want an opinion. Jonah said, I want an opinion. Reed nodded. He said, next week. Next week, Jonah said. Reed buttoned his coat. He walked toward the door and stopped once and looked back, not because there was anything to look back at, just because the particular quality of the room required it. The man standing in the middle of the empty chairs in the gray light, his brother's order of service on the seat beside him, the hands at his sides which had been contained all day and were now simply resting, not managing, not holding, just there. Reed said, he was right about you. Whatever he knew, he was right. Jonah looked at him, the gray eyes, open now, the door unlocked. He said, how do you know what he knew? I don't, Reed said, but I know you, a little. And if he knew you the way you described, he was right about what he knew. He went out into the corridor. He found the second door on the left, which was empty and dark, the Hartley. Service long concluded. He stood in the empty room for a moment, the right room that he had never been in, and felt the specific texture of a day that had not gone as expected and had, in the not going as expected, given him something he would not have found in the going as planned. He went out into the parking lot. The rain had stopped while he was inside, which sometimes happened. You were in a room with other people's grief, and the weather sorted itself out without you. He stood in the wet evening air and found his brother's number and pressed call. His brother answered on the second ring. He said, Reed, with the voice of a man who had not expected the call and was still deciding what to do with it. Reed said, yeah, it's me. I know it's been a while. He paused. I was at a funeral today and I was thinking about you. His brother was quiet for a moment. Then he said, okay, I'm here. What were you thinking? Reed stood in the parking lot with the wet asphalt reflecting the lights and the building behind him containing the last of the day's grief, and he told his brother what he'd been thinking, all of it, without editing it down to the size he thought his brother could receive, without the management he had been practicing for years, the art of keeping himself small enough not to require too much. He told him about the 2 years of silence and what had filled it, which was mostly nothing, which was the problem. He told him about moving to a new city and what it had shown him about the life he'd left and what he still wanted from it, and what he'd thought the distance would clarify and whether it had. He talked the way he hadn't talked to his brother in years, which was freely, without the monitoring, without the constant checking of whether he was asking too much or saying too much or taking up more space than he was owed. His brother listened. He did not interrupt and did not deflect. At one point he said, I didn't know you felt that way. Not with accusation, but with the genuine surprise of a man who had been operating on incomplete information and was updating it in real time. Reed said, I didn't say it. His brother said, You could have. And then, after a pause, you can. And then, after a longer pause, in the voice of someone also releasing something they had been holding. I've been waiting for you to call. I didn't know how to call first. I thought you needed the space, and I kept giving it to you. And at some point, I realized I didn't know when enough space became too much. Reed said, Now. His brother said, Now what? Reed said, Now is when enough space became too much. So I'm calling. They talked for 30 minutes. When he hung up, he stood for a moment longer in the evening air. He looked back at the building on Keswick Street, at the lit windows on the second floor where the lights were still on, and he thought about a man standing in a room full of empty chairs who had spent a day managing everyone's grief but his own, who had spotted a stranger in the back row and had said, Stay, who had handed his phone over without being asked. He thought about distance, about the version of it that was useful and the version of it that was just being far away, about a man named Marcus who had said those were different things and who had, by one remove and one wrong door, managed to say it to someone who needed to hear it. Reed walked to his car. He drove through the wet October streets with the radio off and the city arranging itself in the windows, and he thought, next week. He thought about a kitchen ceiling and an opinion and the specific and ordinary intimacy of being invited somewhere to look at a thing. He thought about how you could walk into a room by mistake and find that the mistake was the most accurate thing you had done in years. He drove. He thought about gray eyes in an empty room. He thought about the grammar of stay, the weight of it, the way it landed in a person when it was spoken without managing it, without the usual surrounding structure of politeness and good manners. Just the naked fact of a man saying, I wanted you here and I told you so. He thought about what it cost to say that. He thought about all the things that happened in the wrong rooms. He thought about what he had said when he was leaving. He was right about what he knew. He had said it because it was true and because Jonah had looked like a man who had spent 11 days receiving the grief of other people, and no one had said anything to him about who he was rather than what he had lost. The two were related, but were not the same. You could receive all the condolences in the world and still be fundamentally unseen by them if every sentence began with your brother rather than with you. He thought, I am going to be exactly on time for that appointment. He had been right to stay. He had known it from the first hymn, when he had looked at the order of service with the wrong name on the front and had found himself unable to get up, unwilling to be anywhere else, held by something that was not the grief of the room, but was not separate from it either. The way you stayed in places that asked something of you, the way presence was sometimes an accident and sometimes not, and sometimes both at once, all three true simultaneously, the way the best things were true. Next week, he had said. Next week, Jonah had said. And the word had the specific sound of a door that was not closing but opening, unhurried and deliberate, the sound of a thing beginning in the ordinary particular way that things actually began, not with a declaration or a moment of certain knowledge, but with a kitchen ceiling and a question and two men in a wet October evening who had ended up against all reasonable navigation in exactly the right place. The city moved past the windows. He thought about Marcus, who had driven without a map because he was interested in the questions. He thought about what Marcus would have said about this afternoon, about a stranger sitting in the back row of his funeral, and his brother keeping the stranger there for 4 hours, and the two of them ending up in chairs by the window while the room emptied around them. He thought Marcus would have found this entirely unsurprising. He thought Marcus would have looked at it and said, Yes, of course, that's how it works. You take the wrong door and it opens into the right room. That's always how it works if you're paying attention. He thought, I was paying attention. He drove through the October evening and he was paying attention now too, to the lit windows above the wet streets and the smell of rain through the cracked window and the specific and unrepeatable quality of a day that had not gone as expected and had therefore gone better than expected, the way days sometimes did when you were willing to stay in the wrong room, long enough to find out what it was for. He drove home. He thought about next week. He thought it was not very far away at all.